One of the things that is so important today is that India and the government of India takes seriously this matter. It is extremely serious, and it has far-reaching consequences in international law and otherwise. The government of India needs to take this matter.
A diplomatic firestorm between Ottawa and India today after Prime Minister Justin Trudeau announced the government has credible intelligence the Indian government is potentially linked to the murder of a Sikh leader in British Columbia earlier this year. Canada expelled an Indian diplomat last night in response, and today India did the same to a Canadian diplomat. India is also rebuking Canada's accusation, but both countries are allowing their high commissioners to remain in position. Let's unpack all of that with the front bench this evening. With me, former New Brunswick Liberal Premier Brian Gallant is here. He's the CEO of Space Canada now. Former Conservative Deputy Leader Lisa Raitt is with us. She's now the Vice Chair and Managing Director of Global Investment Banking at CIBC. CTV News political analyst and former NDP leader Tom Mulcair is with us. And rounding us out this evening, the Toronto Star's Queen's Park Bureau Chief Rob Benzie. Hi, everybody. Rob, I'll start with you because just prior to the show, I was talking to Dick Fadden and Vincent Rigby, my first guest, former NSAs to the Prime Minister. And we were kind of collectively saying yesterday when the Prime Minister stood up and said this, there was a lot of jaws, including the three of ours, that dropped at the prospect of him making this announcement and how significant it was. It's a pretty big deal that this accusation is being leveled, and the way in which it happened so publicly is also pretty, I mean, in my mind, fairly unprecedented.
I think it is unprecedented, Vassy. I mean, it's not often that the New York Times does a breaking news alert on something that happens in Parliament, or that the Daily Telegraph, or that the Guardian, to speak of two newspapers in the UK that are doing the same things. This is a seismic thing that happened because India is the world's largest democracy, a huge trading partner, our 10th largest trading partner with Canada. You know, 1 in 25 Canadians is of Indian heritage, so it's a huge domestic thing for us. But for the Prime Minister to say this publicly and say, look, a Canadian citizen was murdered, we have credible evidence that the Indian government may be linked to it. Or, I mean, that's... I was startled by it. I mean, we know I've been in India. I've been to the Canadian High Commission in India. It's one of our largest diplomatic missions anywhere in the world, in fact. And there is concern for sure in India about Canada's indulgence, what the Indians see as Canada's indulgence of Khalistani separatists. And I know that, and it's an issue. But wow, yesterday was a remarkable day, unbelievable.
I think some of the things that Rob points out there, Lisa, are emblematic of just how complicated this will be going forward, given the positioning strategically of India for the West. And I say that as, you know, in direct contrast to, for example, China, where we saw our allies in instances where we were at odds with China very much on side. The Washington Post, for example, tonight is reporting that they're not jumping to condemn what's happening and that they want to see more evidence. And a large part of that is because of the strategic role India plays right now in the Indo-Pacific.
You can't argue with it. Along with you, I was kind of flummoxed by the whole thing. I was actually really shocked. Look, when the Globe and Mail contacts the Prime Minister's office and says, you have until the end of the day, this is what we're running with, the PM now has a decision to make. Am I going to go out there and give the standard pat answer of, you know, this is an ongoing investigation, we don't get involved with these things, we have nothing to say on it? Or does he go out and say, yeah, I heard about it, there's a credible amount of evidence, and we think India is leaked? Now, but for the China incident where he didn't see a memo and he wasn't briefed, maybe he would have been more diplomatic in the handling of this. But to have the situation where he gets hammered by the opposition saying, you didn't know again, did you? You didn't know. You didn't tell us. I guess they had to make the decision, a calculated risk, that they're going to go out and say that we know about this, which is unfortunate because it does have really big ramifications in terms of Canada's economic well-being.
To Lisa's point, though, Brian, if they had come out and handled it in the way that they handled a lot of the stories from the exact same outlet, the Globe and Mail, about China, they would have been on the receiving end of a lot of criticism in that instance.
There's no question. I'm sure that was sort of swirling in their minds, as Lisa mentions. I'm sure they were trying to make the calculation of risk-benefit and obviously what was the best move, given that there was going to be at least some version of this made public. So I think, to your point, yeah, that's swirling. I also think there's probably a little element to someone on the team that they're saying, no, we got some press coming out of India that it didn't go well. at the G20. This will be helpful to paint the picture and give people a sense why it didn't go well. And certainly I know Lisa and Tom have had this experience as well. Sometimes in politics, things happen and you're not able to brief everybody as fully as you'd like, and you'd be able to very fully explain whatever headline that you might be facing. So that might have been swirling as well. Now, the one thing that we have to point out, any prime minister or president that has presented intelligence that is credible that a foreign country was involved in a covert operation within their borders has to act. And it's just a question of whether they do it as publicly as we saw yesterday, given the dynamic, obviously, with a breaking story, was maybe a consideration. Now, the only thing, though, is that it's very important that it be credible. Lisa used the word risk. I'm going to just highlight that. If this ends up not being credible or reliable intelligence, or it's inaccurate in any way, the way that Trudeau did make this announcement certainly kind of garnished coverage, media coverage, that is giving the impression that it's basically a done deal that this happened. So he did try to present it as an allegation, an accusation, but it really kind of came across as he is, simply saying this happened. So if it ends up that it's not the case, he will be exposed to criticism, to having sort of dampened relations with India, as Rob pointed out, an important partner for us for many reasons. You pointed out important partner for the West as well, with the growing influence of China.
You have to think, Tom, that the risk calculation would be, if you don't think that evidence or intelligence is 100% accurate, you wouldn't go out in the way you did.
Fair enough. I think that that's totally true, Vassy, but I also note that it's impossible that Mr. Trudeau learned that yesterday morning. They knew that it was already in the hands of some journalists, and as you've suggested in one of the earlier questions, it's pretty darn likely that they had that information as they headed over to India. That being said, I go back to the image that you used right at the beginning of today's conversation. You talked about it's like a firestorm. Well, what happens in a firestorm is it sucks all the oxygen out of the surrounding area. And by accident or by design, by Mr. Trudeau doing this in such a dramatic fashion in the House, when every single camera and microphone in the country was there to watch the beginning of the fireworks in Parliament, lo and behold, he had such a bombshell that it sucked all the air out of all of the surrounding area. And what happened? That was the news story of the day. They completely dominated the news cycle, and nothing else was able to make it through. So I was listening to before, when you had a couple of people on talking about inflation and this number and that number. All that stuff has just fallen by the wayside. This is the key issue, and I agree with Brian. I mean, this is one of these cases where you'd better have solid information that you can prove. I have no doubt, by the way, that the Canadian government didn't do this without having solid information, but are they going to actually be able to prove it? That's the key thing, because we've got allies like Great Britain. The United States put out a mini statement out of the White House. Great Britain pretty well silent on it. Benzie was talking before about the papers, but the governments, they're the ones that matter. They're not saying too much in support of Canada's assertion here. So I'm anxious to see whether those very close allies realize the gravity of the situation, if indeed we have that much evidence, or is their relationship with this economic giant that India has become going to be more important than anything else, including these grave principles of justice in our own country. If indeed another country carried out an assassination here, it does have very grave consequences.